Chapter 23, The Calm Before the Storm, Part 4. The tension in the air was thick as the group gathered in the lounge between Lucas and Mina's bedroom and Thomas's. They had been through so much, yet the weight of the trial still lingered in their minds. Dira's betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow, and her final plea for survival, offering valuable intelligence in exchange for her life, gnawed at the edges of their thoughts. Mina sat on one of the chairs, her fingers nervously tapping the armrest. "I can't believe she was working for the cult of the Unbound," she said quietly, her eyes distant. "We were all so trusting. I wanted to believe she was on our side." Lucas sat beside her, his brow furrowed as he processed the events. His telepathy had been instrumental in revealing Dira's true intentions, but the weight of knowing that she had been manipulating them all along was hard to bear. He knew the cults were full of hidden agendas, but this felt like a personal betrayal. "We were too trusting," Thomas muttered, pacing the room. He had been unusually quiet since the trial. "But that's on me too. I should have questioned her more." "No," Lucas interjected, looking at Thomas. "We were all distracted, focused on surviving. It's hard to see things clearly when you're just trying to keep moving." Thomas stopped pacing, looking at Lucas for a moment. The tension between them, while not new, felt more pronounced in the wake of Dira's betrayal. "Still, I don't like being caught off guard like that." "We won't let it happen again," Mina said, trying to steer the conversation back towards something constructive. "But we need to focus on what comes next. This war we're preparing for, the Empire. Everything's changing too fast. I don't know if we're ready for it." Lucas looked at her, a quiet understanding in his eyes. "We'll be ready. We have to be." The group sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared responsibilities sinking in. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were preparing for something much larger, something dangerous. After a few moments, Lucas stood up, breaking the silence. "We should get out of here. We've been cooped up long enough." He motioned for the others to follow. "Let's see what this place has to offer. We need to understand the training we're about to undergo." The halls of the HQ were vast, almost labyrinthine in their design. The walls were adorned with strange symbols and tapestries, their meanings unclear, but their presence unsettling all the same. The further they ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The cultists who passed them in the hallways gave respectful nods, though their eyes seemed to linger a little too long, a subtle reminder of the power they held. Eventually, they found themselves in the training areas, where they were introduced to some of the cult's teachers and fighters. There were men and women practicing with swords, others engaged in hand-to-hand combat, and some focused on more esoteric forms of magic. Their dedication was evident, but there was something about them that unsettled the group. A coldness in their eyes, a sense of distance, as if they had already given themselves over to the cause in a way the group wasn't sure they could. One of the fighters, a lean woman with short-cropped hair, greeted them with a nod. "We'll get you started with some basic training. Magic control, physical conditioning, weapon skills. You're going to need all of it." Lucas exchanged a glance with Mina. This was the beginning of a new phase for them, one they hadn't fully anticipated. It wasn't just about survival anymore. They were stepping into the heart of a conflict that would shape the world. In the next chamber, they met Torgar again. His presence was a welcome sight. The dwarf had already made an impression on them during their time in the Dwarven Mountains, and now he seemed like a familiar ally amidst the cold formality of the HQ. He gave them a smile that felt almost out of place in such a serious environment. "I won't be teaching you how to fight," Torgar said with a chuckle. "But I can help with the magic. I'll be meditating with you two," he gestured to Lucas and Mina, "to show you how I control my magic. My earth magic is weak, but it's useful. It's all about concentration." Mina raised an eyebrow. "Meditation? I thought we were here to train for war." Torgar's expression softened. "Meditation is part of that. You have to master yourself before you can master your powers. It's not just about strength, it's about control. And I've seen too many rush into battle without it." Thomas, standing a little off to the side, rolled his eyes. "Right. Meditation," he muttered under his breath. "How does sitting around focus on my breathing help in a fight?" "You'll see," Torgar replied with a knowing smile. "It's not always about force. Control gives you the upper hand. Thomas crossed his arms, clearly skeptical, but he didn't argue further. The idea of meditation felt far removed from the physical training he had expected, especially since he didn't have any magic to control in the first place. But the sense of purpose that Torgar exuded was undeniable, and part of Thomas knew that there was something important to what the dwarf was saying. After a brief introduction, Torgar left the group to prepare for the next day. "We start tomorrow. Rest up," he said before disappearing down the corridor. The group, now alone again, exchanged looks. There was no denying it. Training was going to be intense, and the 5 days ahead of them would shape their future in ways they hadn't yet realized. "We need to rest," Lucas said, breaking the silence. "Tomorrow is going to be difficult." They all nodded in agreement. The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on them, but they knew there was no turning back now. They had a mission, a responsibility to fulfill. And they would face whatever came next, together. They retreated to their rooms, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Wallace, who had remained silent during the exploration of the HQ, was now back in his chamber, preparing for whatever was to come. He had been focused on his own training and the protection of Mina, but even he couldn't ignore the significance of what lay ahead. In their quarters, the group settled in for the night, the hum of quiet anticipation filling the air. Tomorrow would begin the real preparation for the war to come, and it would change them all in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The first days in the Sent One's headquarters passed slowly, and for the most part, the party immersed themselves in the routine of meditation and training. Torgar had been clear from the start. He would not teach them how to fight. Instead, he guided Lucas and Mina through meditation sessions designed to help them gain control over their abilities. The weak earth magic Torgar wielded himself didn't appear powerful, but it was precise, controlled, and grounded. That was something Lucas and Mina would need to learn, how to keep their powers from spiraling out of control. Mina found the meditation surprisingly easy, as though her speed and agility extended to her mind as well. Sitting still was a challenge at first, but as she began to focus on the sensation of her breath and the hum of the earth beneath her, she felt herself slowly becoming more attuned to her own abilities. When she was able to quiet her mind, the flickers of her nature magic calmed as well. The buds and vines that had once surged uncontrollably now seemed like distant echoes waiting for her command. Lucas, on the other hand, struggled more. His telekinesis often went haywire, small objects floating in the air around him before he could fully control them. The sensation was frustrating, like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. But through Torgar's guidance, Lucas was slowly learning to block out his other senses, focusing on just one thing at a time. It wasn't easy, and often he felt like his mind was being stretched beyond its limits, but he could sense a subtle shift. It was as though his powers were waiting for him to understand them better, to let go of the fear that had held him back. Despite the focus on their powers, training also included combat. Lucas and Mina began basic weapon training with some of the cultist instructors. The weapons were simple, wooden swords and blunt tools, but they were intended to teach discipline and control. Mina, with her athletic background, excelled almost immediately, her reflexes as sharp as ever. She found it easy to slip into the movements, her body already trained for quick, fluid motion. Lucas, however, struggled. His mind was not as naturally attuned to the rhythm of combat, and he often found himself overthinking his moves. Yet, the more he practiced, the more he began to develop a sense for it. His training wasn't about raw strength, it was about patience and precision, something he could understand. Thomas, ever the pragmatic one, seemed frustrated with the training at first. There was no magic to control for him, no way to contribute through powers like Lucas and Mina. Instead, his training focused on more traditional combat, his experience in martial arts making him a quick study. The instructors, seeing his skill, pushed him further than the basics, giving him advanced techniques. He practiced with an intensity that was hard to match. He didn't take to meditation well, but it seemed to calm him to some degree. The long hours of physical training gave him a purpose beyond just survival. They gave him a way to fight back. The martial arts and unarmed combat portion of their training felt more like second nature to Thomas and Mina. Both were well-versed in self-defense, and the techniques in the training were basic enough for them to add their own flair, pushing themselves further than the instructors anticipated. Lucas, however, began with the basics. Each punch, each block, each defensive move felt foreign to him, and yet there was something in the rhythm of it that slowly started to click. It was almost like learning a new language. Awkward at first, but the more he practiced, the clearer it became. In the quieter moments of the day, Lucas found himself wandering the corridors of the headquarters. One day, the cultists led him to the library, a vast room filled with ancient texts and records. The space was quieter than anything he'd ever encountered, and he found himself lost among the shelves. Some of the books were in languages he couldn't read, but the sheer volume of information was overwhelming. What drew him in were the commodities available for accessing knowledge. There were terminals and magical devices that allowed him to tap into information as easily as he could summon a thought. He spent hours poring over maps, texts, and data about magical theory, even though much of it was beyond his immediate understanding. There was so much to learn, and yet it seemed that time was running out. Meanwhile, Mina found a different place to practice. She was given access to a large arena, a wide open space where she could hone her powers without the risk of causing harm. The first time she stood in the center of the arena, her speed seemed to manifest on its own. She dashed from one side to the other, her feet barely touching the ground. As she increased her pace, she could feel the magic beginning to surge within her, her connection to the earth beneath her amplifying her movements. She was more than just fast. She was in tune with the environment around her, using it to her advantage. It felt like freedom, an expression of everything she had longed for. Lucas, too, had the arena to practice his powers. His pyrokinesis and telekinesis were still in their infancy, but he felt the potential within him. The first time he tried to manipulate fire, a small flame flickered from his palm before quickly dying out. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that his powers could grow. He spent hours focusing on his telekinesis, picking up rocks and other small objects, struggling to keep them suspended in midair. But as the days went on, he felt the smallest shifts, his focus sharper, his control tightening. The training felt grueling at times, the hours stretching endlessly. But in those moments of silence, when their bodies were tired and their minds focused, there was a shared understanding among them. Each of them had a different role to play, and each of them was moving closer to their potential. By the end of the 5th day, the group had changed. Not dramatically, but in ways that were noticeable. Their control over their powers was improving, their bodies sharper, their minds clearer. And yet, there was still so much left to learn. In the quiet of the evening, after another day of exhausting training, Thomas, Mina, and Lucas sat together in their chambers, reflecting on the days that had passed. There was no conversation of what the future held, only the understanding that the path ahead was one they would walk together. It had been 5 days. 5 days of pushing themselves beyond their limits, of learning new things, of growing into their roles. They had made progress, but the real challenges were yet to come.